Okay, so have you ever, walked out of a meeting or hung up the phone and felt like you just went 12 rounds in the dictionary?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Like you both spoke English the entire time, but you left feeling like you were talking about completely different things.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, it turns out language is kind of designed for that kind of confusion.
Right.
And today's deep dive is going to unpack why that happens.
Okay.
We're diving into the weird world of words.
I like it.
And to help us out with this, we're going to use a series of articles from a blog called Philosophics.
Okay.
And they really do a great job of breaking down complex philosophical ideas in a way that's interesting and approachable, but also honestly kind of funny at times.
That's a tough line to walk.
It is.
Yeah.
But, so this isn't just a, trip through philosophy lane for no reason.
Right.
By understanding how language itself works or doesn't, you walk away with some serious aha moments that can really help you navigate those difficult conversations about pretty much anything. So let's rewind all the way back to the beginning.
Okay.
Forget Shakespeare, forget emojis. We're talking OG communication.
Right.
Like those first grunts and gestures that really were less about poetry and more about, hey, don't step on that saber-toothed tiger.
Exactly. And picture our early ancestors.
Yeah.
And, their internal language was probably really deeply intertwined with just their senses.
Right.
Survival was priority number one.
Uh-huh.
So being able to signal danger immediately was absolutely essential, flame hot.
Flame hot.
But something abstract ideas like justice or truth.
Right. Not so much.
Not a high priority back then.
Not a high priority.
It's almost like that, that feeling you get when you're standing too close to a fire.
Yeah.
You don't need a scientific explanation to know that's a bad idea.
Right.
But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Humans form larger groups. And communicating these primal ideas to each other.
Right. Became really important for survival.
Absolutely.
And that's where Philosophics introduces us to Bob.
Bob.
Poor Bob.
Yeah.
Bless his heart, just could never quite get the memo.
Right.
The articles use him as this recurring example of that one person who, no matter how clear you think you're being, always seems to miss the point.
No.
Hey, Bob, those berries are poisonous, but he's already halfway through the handful.
Oh, Bob.
Bob's not doing so well.
Classic Bob.
But it's, Bob's misadventures really highlight this key turning point in language where it stopped being just about individual survival and became a tool for social negotiation.
Interesting.
So now it wasn't enough to just understand something yourself.
Right.
You had to convince someone else who might have completely different instincts and life experiences than you.
Totally. And that's where those early misunderstandings start popping up.
Exactly. Right. And that's where even those, straightforward warnings like that creature has big teeth danger could mean different things to different people.
For sure.
Grunts to Gibberish points out that early miscommunication wasn't always about intelligence.
Right.
But about, people having different survival strategies.
Totally.
Like what was dangerous to you might have been dinner for somebody else.
Right. Yeah.
So fascinating how this, early stage of language development really laid the groundwork for how we use language today.
It did. It's the foundation.
Yeah.
For everything.
To persuade, to influence, to, establish social hierarchies. It's not just about conveying information.
Yeah.
It's about navigating those complex social dynamics.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is this is really where we start to see the limitations of language.
Okay. How so?
Well, we've moved beyond grunting at each other,
Here.
which is progress.
Yeah, big step.
Right. But where language gets really, really interesting is when we start talking about abstract ideas.
Okay.
This is where it gets good.
All right. So how do we even begin to unpack that?
Well, to really understand this, we need to bring in Ferdinand de Saussure.
Okay.
Are you familiar with Saussure?
I'm not sure that I am.
Okay. So Saussure was this Swiss linguist.
Okay.
And he came up with this concept of signifier and signified.
Okay.
And it's actually really crucial here.
All right.
So basically, it's this idea that when you say a word, let's just say tree.
Okay.
You're not actually referring to the physical tree itself.
Okay.
But to a mental concept.
Uh-huh.
A symbol that represents treeness.
Oh, okay.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it's kind of like
Yeah.
that famous Magritte painting.
Oh, yes.
The one with the pipe.
Yes, with the caption, "This is not a pipe."
This is not a pipe.
Yeah.
And it's a picture of a pipe.
Exactly. A picture of a pipe is not the pipe itself.
Right.
Just like the word tree is not the actual tree.
It's just a pointer.
It's a symbol.
And this is where it gets so slippery.
Yes.
Because if even a word like tree is really just a stand-in for our own individual idea of a tree, imagine the chaos when we start talking about these really abstract nouns.
Oh, yeah.
Like freedom or justice.
Exactly. Those abstract nouns have no, like,
Right.
set physical reality to anchor them.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
like my idea of freedom could be completely different from yours,
Totally.
even though we're using the same word.
We think we're on the same page, but we're not even close.
Exactly. And philosophics uses the example of freedom as like this prime example.
Okay.
Because for some people, it might mean freedom from oppression.
Right.
For others, it might mean the freedom to make their own choices.
Right.
Even if those choices are bad choices.
Right. Or at least choices that other people wouldn't make.
Right, exactly.
But it's the same word.
Same word.
Totally different meaning.
Wildly different meanings.
Have you ever thought about a time when you had a disagreement with somebody and later realized you were using the same word but in two totally different ways?
All the time.
Yeah.
And Saussure really helps explain why that happens.
It does.
And it's way more common than we realize.
I bet.
Yeah.
But just as we're wrapping our heads around this idea of language as just this giant free-for-all of interpretation, humans went and invented something that made it even more complicated.
What's that?
The written word.
Oh, boy.
And with written language, communication wasn't confined to just the moment anymore.
Right.
Now, ideas could be preserved, passed down through generations.
Right.
And of course, misinterpreted on a whole new scale.
Oh, yeah.
And if you think a misinterpreted text message is bad, imagine trying to decipher a philosophical text from centuries ago.
Right, it's a recipe for disaster.
And then, of course, the printing press just magnifies all of this.
Oh, absolutely.
It's like that tweet that goes viral.
Yeah.
But now everyone's misinterpreting it.
Right.
But imagine that with religious texts or political manifestos.
And ink and instability actually uses Martin Luther.
Oh.
And his 95 Theses as a prime example of how the printed word could lead to all these unintended consequences.
So what did Luther want with his critiques of the church?
Well, he wanted to reform the Catholic Church.
Uh-huh.
But those ideas that he wrote down were received and interpreted by the masses very differently.
In ways he probably didn't intend at all.
Exactly.
Wow.
And it ended up sparking this wave of religious upheaval.
Really?
Yeah, with tons of new denominations popping up.
Wow.
All claiming to have the true understanding of Luther's words.
Wow. So it really makes you appreciate how much weight words can carry?
It really does.
Especially when they're set in stone or at least in ink.
For sure. Yeah, it really does. It makes you think about how much power words really have.
It does. And as if things weren't complicated enough already with, the written word.
Right.
Along comes this philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein.
Oh, yeah.
And he really just dumps gasoline on the fire.
Okay.
And this is where we dive into this world of language games.
One of my favorite topics.
Okay, so tell me more about that. What are language games?
So Wittgenstein, he argued that instead of looking for some fixed meaning for words, we should think of language as all these different games that we're playing.
Okay.
And each game has its own set of rules and objectives.
So instead of just assuming that we all agree on what a word game means,
right,
Wittgenstein is saying, hold on, what game are we even talking about right now?
Exactly. Are we talking about, a board game? A sport?
Right.
Or just a playful exchange of words?
Yeah. So the meaning of the word changes depending on the context.
Yeah. The players, the rules we bring to the table.
And that explains why we have these disagreements where we're both technically using the same words,
right,
but we're talking past each other.
Exactly. We're playing different games with different rule books.
It's like trying to play chess with someone who's playing checkers.
Exactly. Just doesn't work.
Total chaos.
Yeah. And it can be so frustrating.
It really can. But thankfully, after Wittgenstein throws this linguistic curveball at us, Noam Chomsky comes along with his theory of universal grammar.
Yes.
Which kind of tries to put some order back into the universe.
To be more optimistic.
Right. So tell me a little bit about that, because honestly, I could use a little optimism right now.
Yeah. So Chomsky's theory, it's actually really fascinating.
Okay.
So he argued that despite all of the incredible diversity of human languages,
right,
there's this fundamental structure like a linguistic blueprint that's hardwired into our brains.
Okay.
That allows us to learn language in the first place.
So, like, no matter where you're born, your brain is pre-wired for language.
Exactly. And he suggests that there's this underlying grammar, these universal rules that connect all human languages.
Okay, so that explains why, like, even if you've never heard the word unicorn before,
right,
your brain can still make sense of a sentence like, the unicorn ate a rainbow.
Exactly. You instinctively understand the basic structure.
Wow, that's amazing.
It is pretty amazing. Right?
It is, but Philosophics points out that, like, even with universal grammar,
it doesn't totally solve the word meaning problem.
That's true.
Because we still have all those layers of, like, interpretation, cultural context.
Yeah.
You know, our own personal experiences.
Right.
That really color how we understand and use language.
It's true. Chomsky explains how we learn language.
Right.
But not necessarily how we use it.
Okay, so we can all agree that cake is delicious.
Okay.
But like what I find delicious, you might not.
Exactly. And Chomsky can't account for all those individual taste buds.
He can't. Which actually is kind of a nice segue into talking about Steven Pinker.
Okay.
Because he sees language as this like delightful thing.
Oh, yeah. Tell me more.
So he's a cognitive scientist who really focuses on the evolutionary advantage of language.
Yeah.
Like he says, language is the reason that we evolved from cave dwellers into podcast listeners.
That's a good thing, right?
I think so. I mean, I like podcasts.
Me too.
So Pinker's language instinct theory, it really emphasizes like how essential language has been for our survival.
Because it enables, you know, cooperation, complex thought, the transmission of knowledge.
It's true. It's allowed us to achieve incredible things.
But even Pinker, with all of his enthusiasm for language, would agree that it's not perfect.
Right.
Like we can say freedom is essential. And grammatically it makes sense, but what does that actually mean in practice?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. And that kind of brings us to like the most controversial theory of them all.
Okay, let's hear it.
The Sapir-Worf Hypothesis.
Oh, yeah. This is where things get really interesting.
This is where things go from language is weird to language might actually be like bending my reality.
Right. So buckle up.
Yeah, this is going to be a wild ride.
Okay, so the Sapir-Worf Hypothesis,
yeah,
in like its strongest form, suggests that the language we speak, it doesn't just influence how we think.
Okay.
It shapes our perception of reality.
So it's not just that having different words for things makes us pay more or less attention to them. It's that if we don't have a word for something, we literally can't even perceive it.
It's a very radical idea.
Yeah, so like Philosophics talks about the Inuit people.
Okay.
And how they have all of these words for snow.
Right.
And the idea is that having those specific terms lets them see distinctions in snow. That somebody who just calls it all snow wouldn't even notice.
Yeah.
But then Sapir-Worf takes it a step further and says, like, what if your language doesn't have the word blue?
Okay.
Would you even be able to see the sky as blue?
That's the big question, isn't it?
And I don't know about you, but that's where I have to, like, pump the brakes a little bit.
Yeah.
Because if that's true, wouldn't learning a new language be like stepping into a whole different reality?
Right. Like, what happens when we translate?
Exactly.
See, those missing concepts just, like, disappear.
So the Sapir-Worf hypothesis,
yeah,
it's intriguing, but it's also like highly debated.
It is. There's evidence to support both sides.
Right.
Like, I mean, it seems unlikely that language like completely dictates reality. But at the same time, you know, there's no denying that language influences how we categorize and make sense of the world around us.
Right. It's probably not as extreme as like seeing a different reality.
Right.
But it's definitely more than nothing.
Yeah. It's like having a slightly different filter on your camera lens.
So language might not be holding us hostage in a conceptual prison or anything.
Right.
But it definitely has some influence over what we see and how we see it.
It does. It shapes our perceptions, for sure. It does. It really shapes how we see things.
It makes you wonder, like, with language changing so fast these days, are we just headed for a giant Tower of Babel moment?
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Where nobody understands each other.
Right. Because the internet has really, like, democratized language in a way.
Right.
Everyone has a platform of voice.
Right.
But it's also easier than ever for things to get lost in translation.
For sure. And, you know, it's like we have more ways to connect with people who share our interests and passions and, you know, our opinions about important things like pineapple on pizza.
The big issues.
Exactly. But it also feels like it's easier to get stuck in these echo chambers.
Oh, totally.
Where, you know, everyone's already speaking the same language or at least the same version of it. Yeah. And those dissenting voices get drowned out.
Yeah, it's like we're all speaking different dialects of the internet.
It's so true. And that actually, that echo chamber effect, I think, really highlights the importance of everything we've been talking about today. Like the importance of understanding those hidden layers of language.
Right.
Recognizing that, like, we could be using the same words, but we're not necessarily saying the same thing.
Exactly. We all have our own personal dictionary.
Yeah, we do. We really do. So after going on this deep dive into language, what are the key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, philosophics really stresses this idea of becoming more conscious communicators.
Okay.
Like, it's not enough to just use words.
Right.
We have to think about what those words actually represent.
Oh, totally. And, like, especially when it comes to abstract ideas.
Especially abstract ideas.
Right. Because, like, if I'm going to debate the meaning of life with you, I want to be sure we're even talking about the same life.
Exactly. What does life even mean?
Right. Because, like, your life might involve a lot more yoga than mine.
Definitely more yoga.
And a lot of it is about being willing to just, like, ask those clarifying questions.
Right.
Like, admitting that misunderstanding is, like, always on the table.
Yeah. Humility is key.
Yeah. And approaching these conversations with, a healthy dose of humor.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, we're all just trying to figure things out. We're trying to connect with each other.
Right.
And hopefully share a laugh or two along the way.
And if that means, taking a minute to define our terms or, like, really think about what that emoji means.
Yeah, I got to decode those emojis.
It is worth it.
It's worth it to avoid a philosophical war.
Right. All those strongly worded letters to the editor.
Exactly.
So, language, it's powerful.
It is.
But it's also flawed.
Deeply flawed.
And I think this discussion has given us all a lot to think about.
For sure.
It's really amazing how much complexity we kind of just, like, gloss over.
Yeah, we take it for granted.
In something as basic as language, and it really makes you wonder, like, if language is so flawed, are there other ways that we can understand the world and connect with each other?
Yeah, don't rely on words at all.
That don't even use words at all.
Right.
That's something to think about.
It is something to think about.
Well, until next time, happy communicating, everybody.